Hey everyone, Dogen here. So it's been a while since I've done a long-form Q&A video about Japan, and I got about 100 questions on Twitter from people that are asking about living here, studying here, teaching English here, raising a family here, etc., etc. So let's just try and get through some of these, and I'll try and be a little bit quicker than usual because I tend to drag on a little bit too long for each question. So first question from my friend Iku Tree, who is an artist that finally got here on study abroad. So congrats, Iku, and let's get to your question. Oddly enough, my current question is how to create a good foundation when it comes to intercultural dating and relationships. Finding common ground with serious communication differences would be interesting from your standpoint. I think this is a very mature question because there are a lot of foreigners that want to have a relationship with the Japanese people and a lot of Japanese people that want to have a relationship with a foreigner without thinking about kind of the nitty gritty. And what would you say? You only think about the ups when you're thinking about having a romantic relationship. And when you think about things that optimistically, obviously, it's that much rougher when you're actually hit with conflict down the road. So very mature question again to begin with. But I think in that sense, if you got to have some common ground in a language that each of you speak. But I also think that more than anything, it's the mindset. And I think that if you're going into a relationship with this mindset, rather than just like, oh, I want to date a Japanese girl, or oh, I want to date a Japanese guy, if you're open and mature about things and you both speak at least, one language fluently that you can, communicate with, if you sit down with that person at the beginning of the relationship and be like, hey, we're in an intercultural relationship, and because of that, we're going to be facing a bunch of hardships that probably wouldn't come up if we came from the same background. And if you just go in with that, again, with that mindset, and you're very open and you communicate a lot, I think that that's probably the best thing that you can do. It's hard to say, whether that'll work or not, because there's so many factors when it comes in with regards to relationships. But I think communication is key regardless, even if you're coming from the same culture. Very mature question, and I think from that mature standpoint, you're going to be off to a good start. Question from Fruth. How are you finding school/life, etc. for your twins in a smaller and comparatively less international city like Beppu? We just had a kid, and Tokyo has a lot of options, but am curious how it is further away from the bubble. So a lot of people don't know this. I've talked about this a few times in the past, but Beppu is actually arguably more international than Tokyo. And that's because Beppu has the highest concentration, either the highest or the second highest concentration of a ratio of foreigners to Japanese people of any city in Japan, except for, I believe, Kyoto. And the reason that there are so many foreigners in Beppu is because there's a university here that, APU, where I used to work, and half of the students there are from outside of Japan. They're international students. Many of them graduate and end up staying in Beppu. But then also half of the faculty, so half of the teachers at APU are also foreign. And then many of the staff, so people doing working at the career office, doing admissions, recruitment work like what I used to do, they're also international, again, like me, non-Japanese. So many people that, whether they attend APU as a student or work at APU, end up leaving it eventually and then just staying in Beppu because Beppu is a it's a very comfortable town to live as a foreigner because people are used to interacting with foreigners. So when you go into the city office as a foreigner, or if you try and rent an apartment in Beppu as a foreigner, etc., then it's very streamlined, relatively speaking. There's still a lot of red tape because I think that's just kind of, what would you say, a characteristic of Japanese culture to begin with. But relatively speaking, there's less red tape because you're a foreigner. Now, the question that I believe Fruth was asking was, with regards to raising kids here. And the reason I gave that kind of long introduction is because the teachers here are used to dealing with mixed kids as well. And there are so many instances in Beppu where I've taken my kids to a park or something like that, and I'll meet another mixed family It happens all the time. It's actually quite difficult for me to answer this question because I think that you were under the impression I think that you were trying to ask, what's it like raising kids in a non-international city? But again, I can't really answer that because Beppu is in fact a very international city. One other thing that I'd like to touch on for this question is that I've been to every major international school in Japan because when I was working at APU and I was doing student recruitment, it was my job to try and go to schools that Japanese students were going to. It was my job to go to international schools and recruit to try and encourage the Japanese students that were going there to come to APU. So I've been to all like the private international schools in Tokyo and in Yokohama. There's a bunch in Yokohama and Osaka and Fukuoka as well. And it's funny because many of them are, again, they're private and they're like $10,000, $15,000 a year. They're very, very expensive and they do provide a very, very good education. But because Japan is currently going through a depopulation crisis, the population is shrinking, you can actually, in a place like Beppu, and many other kind of just smaller cities in general, the classroom sizes are so small to begin with that you can get, even though the type of curriculum is going to be fundamentally different if you're going to a public Japanese school, you can still get a very personalized experience because you can get a great education from like a private school that's $15,000 a year, $10,000 a year. But in that setting, you might be like one of 20 students in a classroom. And even if the teacher is a fantastic teacher, I'd argue that there's still something to be said about a public school that has like 10 students to one teacher. And there are many schools like that in kind of the smaller cities in Japan. So maybe good food for thought. Brandon. Hey, Brandon, how's it going? As an American, how do you feel about the culture of children traveling on their own? Young kids taking the train alone or grocery shopping, etc. Just curious what it's like to adjust to that when it's less common in the US. My kids are still at the age where I still have to accompany them basically anywhere because they're in preschool right now. So I can't just kind of like let them hop on the bus and do whatever they want. But again, that's one of the reasons that I like living in a smaller city like Beppu because there are less people rushing, less people like running red lights and that kind of thing, less things to worry about as a parent when you're letting your kids go out to play for the first time. So again, it's hard for me to say because I'm not quite there yet, but I do think that living in a smaller city like this will make the transition process for me as a foreigner easier. Having twins, are there any differences in how each of them are currently acquiring languages? Not really. I will say that we mostly speak English at home almost entirely. It's odd because of my work. Obviously, there are instances in which it's just more naturally for me to say something in Japanese. And because I'm very concerned about, I want them to be completely bilingual. Even in instances, and this is very true of recently, in which I can feel the Japanese start to come out, I'll often like pump the brakes and like, okay, what's the right English for this? And then I'll say that instead because it is getting to a point with them going to a public Japanese school where their Japanese is starting to outpace their English by a considerable amount. And I think that I gotta like help them play as much catch up as possible. So we read a lot of Dr. Seuss books at home. And you asked if there were any differences between the two, and not really. Basically, they're both at a point where their Japanese is starting to outpace their English. And I'm trying to combat that by doing my best to teach them as much English as possible. Okay, how good is the entrepreneur/startup environment? As there exists a senior-junior hierarchy, how are young company owners perceived? How supportive is the government in such matters? Based on the people that I know, and I've got a private accountant that works here and stuff like that. Again, he also says it's not that difficult. It's just that not a lot of people do it. And one thing that I would say is that although it might not be terribly hard on paper to officially create a business in Japan, officially create a company in Japan, I would expect a lot of hesitance or not resistance from the people around you. Like when I quit my job at APU, there was a lot of people around me that were like, you shouldn't quit APU. Like APU is part of a larger, big Japanese kind of holding, not company. I can't think of the right English word. I apologize for that. But they're like, you got it a decent job right now, and it wasn't really a decent job in my eyes, but they were like, at least it's stable. At least it's stable. I was like, nope, not happening. Like, I'm quitting APU and I'm going to pursue this YouTube thing. And I'm very glad that I did, because I'm making a lot more money than I used to make at APU doing YouTube. And on top of that, I like doing my YouTube stuff. Like, APU is a great university, and for certain people, it might be really fun to work there. But I personally didn't like working there because although the school is very, very interesting and very unique, I do better in like creative environments and that kind of thing. So long story short, expect people to kind of give you some resistance and be like, you might be safer doing what you're currently doing. But again, that's just, if you can put up with that and just kind of ignore the haters, so to speak, you can probably make it happen. Okay, so Elizabeth and also AJ in Kyoto. First, from Elizabeth, how strict is the workplace in Japan really like, especially in terms of karoshi, so like overworking to death? Has it become a less intense work environment in recent years? And then AJ in Kyoto is saying gaijin seat, gender discrimination in the workplace, and then bullying in schools. So I think the best way to answer these two questions is that Japan is not like a single entity. And what I mean by that is one Japanese company might have a fundamentally different work environment than a different Japanese company. APU, where I used to work, the working conditions were actually quite good. Again, I didn't like working there because it didn't suit my personality. It wasn't because the work conditions were like really, really rough and I was like overworked or anything like that. I worked from 9 to 5 each day, and then very occasionally I would do some paid overtime, and that was it. And I didn't, make a lot of money. I think I was making about $2,000 a month. APU had a great work environment, but I've worked at like headhunting companies in Tokyo as well, and I've also done some translation where it's much, much more demanding, where it's like you're going to get compensated based on your performance. And in that sense, and also the compensation isn't going to be that good. So you're going to have to work very, 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 very hard. And if you screw up, you're going to be reprimanded. And I've been in that situation. I don't know too much about gender discrimination in the workplace, but again, bullying in schools, this is again very, very situational because, again, going back to that first question, there are foreigners and foreign kids as well all over Beppu. So like, my kids are currently going to this really great school, but I know that even if they changed schools in Beppu, that it wouldn't really be an issue because there's at least like a couple of foreign students in, if not every grade at each major public school here, then at least at each school. I've read a lot of anecdotes about, parents that they've, had to deal with, maybe like their child's hair color or something like that didn't match like the school policy, and just like nightmare after nightmare after nightmare. And again, I think that generally speaking, things are much more strict here across the board. But in a place like Beppu, where I am, I've never had to deal with that. Although Japan has a lot of room to improve in many different areas, many of these issues that come up fairly often when people think about living in Japan and working in Japan or raising kids in Japan for the long term. It's oftentimes maybe a little bit more situational than some people realize. That's me speaking from my own personal experience. So take that with a grain of salt. Lunatic, what is the biggest issue for foreign students in Japan? Great question. I think that the biggest issue is getting out of the bubble. And what I mean by that is if you're a foreign student in Japan, either going to like a language school in Japan or studying abroad at a Japanese university, you're going to be in a bubble probably in which you're surrounded by other foreign students that are studying Japanese. This happened to me as well. And the only way that you can kind of get out of that bubble is if you're really, really, if you kind of own it and you take responsibility and be like, I love these people. They're my friends. I love hanging out with them, but I need to get better at Japanese. And in that sense, like, okay, they just invited me out to lunch. I'd love to go. These people are great, but I'm going to say no. And I'm going to try and go talk to those Japanese people over there and see if maybe I can grab lunch with them. It's great to have friends from both groups, but I've found that if you don't really go out of your way to try and make Japanese friends when you're studying abroad in Japan, you're going to get like halfway through study abroad and only have like one or two Japanese friends. And I'd say that based on what I saw and based again from my own experiences, most of the time those Japanese students can speak English as well. And that's why you ended up becoming friends with them so quickly after coming to Japan. You have to make the additional effort, and it's not going to be easy or comfortable. It's so easy again to just hang out with those cool people that you meet studying abroad, because everyone's like you. Everyone is finally just got to Japan. Everyone's really happy. They're really excited for it. They're all pumped, and you're all in the same boat in that sense. You're all super positive and like, oh yeah, we're here. Okay, yeah, let's go out for lunch. And every time you hang out with them, it's going to be a lot of fun. Whereas like if you try and talk to a Japanese person, they might be like on their way to like, their like hip hop dance circle practice or whatever. And you'd be like, hi, I'm an exchange student here. I'm trying to make Japanese friends. Do you want to like get lunch with me? It might be like,いや、忙しいんだけど, like what? I'm busy, sorry. And so you gotta do the additional effort. It's not comfortable. But I tried to do that. Like I was one of, I think, 2 or 3 students that left the dorm that I was living in, the international dorm that I was living in during my study abroad the single year. And I started a homestay like halfway because the homestay option became available. So I did that. And I tried to use as much Japanese as possible. And I think that it paid off. 4 years at this point. Huh?
私のポケモンは寒くないの。
そうだね。Yeah, that's right. Good. Yeah. Okay.
私はね。
Okay, bye-bye. Okay, so that's a good example. Like my daughter, one of my daughters just came in and she was like, 私のポケモン寒くないの? Like, my Pokemon isn't cold right now. And like, I accidentally said in Japanese, そうだね. And again, this is an example of like getting out of the bubble, kind of. Like, in order for my daughters to get better at English, I can't be doing that all the time. I can't just be like, そうだね, かわいいね, or よくできたね, 頑張ったね. Like, it's so easy for me to say these things when my daughters start the conversation in Japanese because it's natural. Like, if someone talks to you in Japanese and you speak Japanese, it's kind of natural to want to respond in Japanese. But I gotta do the additional effort to make sure that they get good at English. And if you're an exchange student, you got to do the additional effort to make sure that you get good at Japanese. Every single instance, every single interaction where you could be speaking the other language and you choose not to because it's that much more comfortable, that comes back to hurt you. That comes back to bite you later on. Interested in hearing your experience on ways to save money on commuting cost, food bills, etc. What tips do you have in this regard outside of the obvious, like not eating out at certain restaurants or going to a bar? I can't get too into this right now, but I highly, highly, highly recommend Shinsei Bank. And that's because if you get up to one of their higher tiers, this applies more to people that are already working here and have some savings, then you can use the ATMs at any of the local banks or at any of the local convenience stores like 7-Eleven, Family Mart, Lawson, I think Mini Stop and stuff like that as well. You can use them for free all the time. And that's huge because Japan is a cash-based society. So there are times when you need cash. And if you're using like a local bank, especially like a Chiho Ginko, which is like a local bank at one of like a smaller, like, Oita Bank or like Nagasaki Bank or like Saitama Bank, et cetera, a lot of these banks, they bank on the fact that people don't know how much the bank is like ripping them off every time they use the ATM after hours or stuff like that. It's like it's $2 gone right there. $2 gone here, and here. And most people don't take the time to add it up all after the fact. And if you do, I did this and it was like, oh my gosh, like I'm like paying like $40 or $50 to Oita Bank every month because I have to pay like these two furikomi, like transfers to like my employee, JP, et cetera, and stuff like that. And it's like, man, like I need to stop doing this ASAP. So I would say look into Shinsei Bank if you're a foreigner. First of all, they have extremely good service when it comes to foreigners. That's one of like their big things. It's like we work with foreigners a lot, and they actually provided me with my new mortgage for my new house, and I'll talk more about this in an upcoming video, but they essentially provide all of their services also in English, and they also have extremely competitive rates. Okay, this is a great question that I've actually been meaning to talk about. Tiny ABZ, tiny abs. How often do earthquakes happen around Japan, especially the incident with Sendai that happened 2 weeks ago? My theory is that Japanese culture, to a certain extent, is the way it is because Japan is extremely susceptible to earthquakes. I read a statistic the other day that 20% of all the earthquakes that happen each year happen in Japan. And that's because Japan, I believe, is on 3 different seismic or tectonic plates, the borders of 3 different tectonic plates. So Japan is just constantly riddled with earthquakes. And I think because of that, the kind of cautiousness that's embedded in Japanese culture, the red tape, the like double checking, triple checking things over and over and over again, I think that's the result of just constant earthquakes. And again, another statistic that I read is that there's at least one mega earthquake like every 100 years. And there has been traditionally a big earthquake like that. And here's another good thing to be aware of if you want to live in Japan. So if you don't know about it, there's this thing called the Nankai Torafu. And what it is, well, there's going to be a giant earthquake that's going to happen in the relatively near future in Japan. And it's not like it might happen, it's going to happen. And the reason for that is because the tectonic plates, there's the sea plate and then the land plate. And the sea plate, it goes under the land plate. And as it goes down under the land plate, it pulls the land plate down. And as the land plate gets pulled down, eventually it gets to a point where it buckles back. It's kind of like a rubber band. Like you can only pull it too much before it snaps. It's the same way with these tectonic plates. There's a giant fault that runs across the entire southern border of Japan, kind of like from Tokyo to Fukuoka, just a little bit south of that runs along that entire coast, and they're expecting a giant earthquake to happen there I think in the 2030s. And if it doesn't happen in the 2030s, it's almost certainly going to happen in the 2040s. It's not a matter of whether or not it occurs, it's a matter of when it occurs. And if you look at Japanese history, you can see that a cataclysmic earthquake along that fault has occurred every 300 years. And we're just about reaching that 300-year mark right now. And this one's going to be so cataclysmic because there's actually like three different faults. And every like 100 years or 150 years, one of those results in an earthquake because the landmass like slips back. But then every 300 years, all 3 of those snap back at once. And so if you look it up, I think it's called like the Toei Jishin datta kana? There was a giant earthquake in the 1700s in Japan that was all across the southern border of Japan. And I think it was either the largest earthquake that Japan has ever recorded or either number 2 right after the 3/11 earthquake that again happened like 11 years ago at this point. How common is the incident that happened in Sendai like 2 weeks ago? I would say that if you're living in Japan, if you intend on living in Japan for at least 5 years, you'll experience during that time, I would say probably regardless of where you live, at least one earthquake that's so big that you get scared during it. Even if it's not very dangerous, you're going to experience at least one that's so big that you get scared. And this has happened to me 2 times at this point. My wife used to work at this place in a nearby city. And when that earthquake that I was scared during happened, it was so big that the place that she worked at got destroyed during it. They had to destroy the building after the fact because there was too much to repair and it would have been better just to start from zero. So they did. This is common. This is going to happen if you live in Japan for the long run. Probably a lot safer to move into like a proper apartment than it is to move into like a traditional Japanese machiya, like a traditional Japanese Kyoto like townhouse or stuff like that. I know that's very popular and cool and there's a certain element of like romanticism, but it's probably not very safe. And you don't want to be in a place that was built like 100 years ago with completely different building regulations when another 9.0 magnitude earthquake happens in the next 15 years or so. Do you have any recommendations for a job to do in Japan just to try living there? Just to try living there for 2 to 3 years? I think the probably best answer is try and become an English teacher. There are many opportunities if you speak English, especially if you're a native English speaker, where you can live in Japan for like 2 or 3 years and teach English here. And you don't need to know, you don't have to have an additional skill. Like you can do it straight out of college on the JET program. And if you don't get into the JET program, you can try applying to like Interact or kind of one of the other alternatives to the JET program. Or you can, depending on where you're coming from, you can try and do like a work holiday and go to like a smaller private English teaching school or something like that. It's not terribly, terribly hard to do that if you're a college graduate. But it can be difficult to find alternatives to the English teaching for just 2 or 3 years in Japan. Tatsu-san, any tips on 就職する for non-engineers who just passed N2? So how to get a job if you're a non-engineer and you just passed N2? For example, do you think attending setsumekai is crucial despite the availability of online platforms like LinkedIn? Do they offer marketing/sales positions for gaijin in setsumekai? So I think this is probably a good opportunity to also talk about one additional thing that I've been meaning to cover in one of these kind of videos for a long time, and that's kind of the Japanese economy in general. The sad truth is that the economy in Japan is not doing well, and it hasn't done well for the past like 30 years or so. After the bubble burst, the average rate of the post-university or university graduate, it's been like at like $2,000. It's been hovering at about $2,000 for 30 years now, and it hasn't changed. Currently, like I think it was like 2 or 3 years ago, the amount of money that the average university graduate makes immediately after graduating was surpassed. Japan got surpassed by Korea. Like if you look at like, I would say most Western countries, almost certainly all of the Southeastern Asian countries that are undergoing incredible growth right now, like Malaysia, Indonesia, many of them haven't yet caught up fully to that $2,000 yet, but they're growing very, very rapidly. And it's just a matter of time before many of them end up overtaking Japan. Chances are if you go and work at a Japanese company, even if the work conditions are good, like what I described earlier, I had good working conditions at APU. I was getting like $2,000 a year or $2,000 a month rather, $2,000 a month married. That's not a lot of money, and it's very, very hard to save any money at all when you're making $2,000 a month in Japan. And it's unfortunate because that's what the overwhelming majority of people in their 20s and many people in their 30s as well make, between $2,000 and $3,000 a month. Things aren't trending in a good direction for the Japanese economy right now. And going back to your original question, which was like, what are Japanese companies looking for? Again, I said that most people aren't going to want to hear this, and this is probably not the advice that you want to hear, but I think it is the best advice, which is that I don't think that it's good for the long run to try and secure a career in like a traditional Japanese company. If it's a Japanese company that's a lot more flexible and is investing a lot in like the employees, like here's a great example. I'm playing Elden Ring right now. Elden Ring developed by From Software and then published by Bandai Namco, I believe. After Elden Ring came out, I think it sold like 12 million copies or something like that. Bandai Namco immediately turned around and said, "We're going to be raising the wages of our employees across the board." Maybe it was like just the engineers. I can't remember, but it was this big number. It was like, we're going to be raising wages like 30% or something like that. That's the kind of company that you want to work for. You want to work for a company that rewards its workers and is a little bit more flexible and is a little bit more, it's not so rigid. And if you can find a company like that, then even if it's a Japanese company, even if it's not a foreign company in Japan, that could be really good. I think that the best thing is to zoom out. I think that's the best thing for most people across the board. Zoom out and think, Do I really want to work at a Japanese company? The Japanese economy hasn't grown in 30 years at this point. Do I want to go work at a traditional Japanese company? Maybe I want to work at a Japanese company that's a little bit more flexible, a little bit more dynamic, is paying their employees well, or maybe I want to work at a foreign company in Japan, or maybe I want to do freelance in Japan. Be flexible and be willing to take some risks, because if you do, I think that there's a good chance that you'll get rewarded for that. If I had chosen to stay at APU, I'd still be making $2,000 a month with a family of 4, me, my wife, and my 2 girls, and it would not be easy. It'd be very, very, very hard. But because I decided to take a risk, because I started working, I did 2 jobs for like 3 years. I did YouTube at night and I did APU in the morning. It paid off. And then I took the risk and said, I'm still not making as much on YouTube right now as I am at APU, but I'm going to quit APU and I'm going to lean into this. And I made it work. And I was very lucky. The stars aligned very well for me. But I think that that's the right choice for a lot of people given the economic trends of the past 30 years in Japan. I think that's probably a good place to end this video. I've got some pretty major updates actually coming in the relatively near future. Some are related to the house that I'm building here that I mentioned, I think, earlier in this video. But it's going to be maybe 4 or 5 comedic videos in the meantime. I'm rambling, so I'm just going to end the video here. Thank you all very much for your support, and I'll see you guys again soon. Sayonara.